It is my honor and great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sally Permar. She is our physician-in-chief in the Department of Pediatrics and the chairman for the Department of Pediatrics at New York Presbyterian, Weill Cornell Medicine. And thank you so much, Dr. Permar, for joining us today.
Thank you to all of the speakers here today. Thank you, Dr. Platt, for that introduction. And also, I really just want to also welcome our attendees who have joined to learn more about how we can continue to garner traction in getting out of this pandemic. I especially want to recognize Dr. Gerber, Dr. Levine, and Dr. Acker, who have taken time to really put their knowledge and information and ability to really bring you the information that you need in a very succinct way. They are going to be wowing you with the information that they'll be able to deliver to you that you've been looking for. So I first just want to remind everyone that we are in a wonderful time, actually, that we have access to a vaccine that was developed in less than a year time after the new introduction of a pandemic virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That this is unlike any vaccine development process that has ever gone forward before, with the shortest time being 4 years before this. And so the fact that we have vaccines available to us is really remarkable, and really is the result of lots of innovation, research, and science that really came together for this time. But it does require that not only are the vaccines here, but we also have to all do our part in getting the vaccines and garnering that immunity that's going to take us all out of the pandemic troubles that we've been dealing in. So you're going to hear a lot today about where we are with the vaccine being delivered. Right now in New York City, there are vaccines are available to those who are 16 and above, who have chronic conditions that are fit the requirements, as well as essential public-facing workers who are in government jobs, as well as in not-for-profit work as well. And so if you're in one of those categories, look for your vaccine opportunity. But we also are looking at new stories coming out of these variants. It is the way that RNA viruses work is to mutate. So it's not so surprising that we're hearing about these, but it also it is a time for us to really double down on the vaccinations, as well as the continued mitigation strategies that we've all been practicing this year of wearing our masks and social distancing. And soon, vaccines for children will be more widely available as the trials really ramp up now from nearly all the vaccine makers, including pediatric trials in their current trials. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Gerber to deliver the presentation, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Permar, and for introducing us. So our presentation tonight is an update on COVID-19. And as has been mentioned, I'm so excited to be joined by my colleagues, Dr. Deborah Levine and Dr. Sherry Platt, also from the Pediatric Emergency Medicine Department, and Dr. Karen Acker from Pediatric Infectious Disease. So as I'm sure everyone is aware, the news stories that have been dominating recently are about the COVID-19 variants. So we're going to start just by talking about what it means to be a variant. What is a variant? And then move on to talk a little bit about the vaccines, and then into our Mythbuster section. And we're going to end off with time for a moderated question and answer session. So as we go along, feel free to type your questions into the Q&A portion of the Zoom meeting. And then just 2 quick notes before we start. The first is that we're learning new information about COVID-19 literally every day, and we've worked really hard to make sure that this presentation is up to date as of today, but we can continue to give updates as things change. And then just a reminder for our question and answer session, we're obviously very happy to answer questions, but we can't give specific personalized medical advice. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking of your questions. So starting with the viral variants. Before we can really get into the viral variants, we have to start by talking about the birds and bees, or reproduction. The overall goal for humans and viruses alike is to reproduce for preservation. We're not going to go into it further how humans do it, I'm sure everyone's aware, but we should take a minute to talk about how viruses reproduce. Humans are made of DNA. It's what makes you, you. It contains the recipe to make every part of our body. Everything is created by following the recipe in DNA. It determines your hair color, your eye color, and how your body grows and functions. Viruses can be made of RNA or DNA. SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is made of RNA. The strand of RNA has the recipe to make all of the pieces of SARS-CoV-2, but the virus can't do it alone. It needs to enter into the body of a human or animal, which we call the host, and use the machinery inside of the host cell to reproduce. The RNA has the code for amino acids, which then comes together to form the proteins of SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-2 obviously doesn't actually have thoughts or feelings, but I'm going to personify it for a minute. The entire goal of SARS-CoV-2 is to reproduce. It doesn't care at all about you. In fact, it doesn't even care that it makes you sick. That's just a side effect of the virus taking over our host cells. That's not its goal. All this virus wants to do is reproduce. But while human reproduction involves careful copying over of the recipe book, the DNA, to make intricate, tiny, amazing, adorable humans, viral reproduction is not as careful and is prone to mistakes. And that's where the variants come from. This picture is a representation of a string of amino acids or a piece of the code for a protein. Mutations are constantly occurring in the RNA genome of SARS-CoV-2 during replication, and sometimes these mutations can lead to a change in one of these amino acids. So to break this down a little bit more, on the left side, you have a string of amino acids where one of them is a D, and on the right, it's changed to a G. And while this doesn't seem like a very big difference, if you consider it in the context of a letter changing in a sentence, he looked over and saw a sock, or he looked over and saw a sack, it changes the meaning of the sentence entirely. A sock and a sack are pretty different things. The viral variants often have several mutations, and while some of them are small and insignificant, they could potentially change the virus significantly. So when we evaluate the mutations on the variants, we have to think about, will this one be more contagious? Will it spread faster? Will it cause more severe disease? And will our antibodies from natural infection or vaccination be protective against reinfection? But before we can answer these questions, we have to look at some of the mutations that we're seeing in these variants. So for those who have heard some of our prior talks, we talk a lot about the spike protein. The spike protein has a really important role in SARS-CoV-2. It's what actually helps the virus get inside the host cells where it needs to be to reproduce. So on the screen are 3 different ways of thinking about that spike protein. All the way on the left is SARS-CoV-2 with that spike protein, which are those little red things on the surface. The middle picture is a big blown up 3D view of the spike protein. And on the right is the written out amino acid recipe for the spike protein. And so that's where a change in the letter can make a difference. And so as we mentioned, the spike protein helps the virus get inside the cells to take over the machinery and reproduce. It's like the hand that turns the doorknob into our cells. The doorknob is actually a receptor on the cell wall that the virus binds to, the ACE2 receptor. And many of the mutations in the variants are changing the spike protein to make it better at getting into our cells. The mutations in the spike protein help the virus get into our cells better in usually one of 2 ways. The first is that some of the mutations cause an increase in the total number of the spike proteins on the virus. Or using our analogy, it would be like if you had more hands to try to reach out and grab the doorknob. If you have more hands, you just have a better chance of grabbing. And then the second type of mutations that we're commonly seeing increase the effectiveness of the binding of the spike protein to that doorknob or to the receptor. So again, going back to our analogy, it's like if you put some honey or some sticky glue on your hand, if you reach out and your hand is able to stick to the doorknob better, you have a better chance of getting into the cell. And so up on the screen are a list of some of the common variants that we've been hearing about in the news. And so hopefully this makes a little bit more sense. These variants are all have a bunch of different mutations, a lot of which are in the spike protein. And so that's why that's why they're circulating more. And that's why, going back to our questions, we have to think out what potential impact these variants could have. And so now my colleague, Dr. Karen Acker, is going to talk about how the vaccines relate to these variants.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Gerber. So I'm going to use this opportunity to give an update about some of the changes that have been going on with vaccines more recently. But firstly, just to give you a reminder on what are antibodies. That's something you hear about a lot in relation to vaccines. So when germs such as viruses enter the body, we know they can make us sick, and our body has an army of white blood cells, and which are soldiers that help fight off the infection. And one of the ways they do this is by making antibodies, this protein that can recognize, this intruder and kind of act like arrows, target that intruder and destroy it or bind to it. So in this picture, is a nice depiction showing this little soldier white blood cell making antibodies, and then the antibodies attach to the virus. And as you can see in the picture, when the antibodies attach to the virus, they block that ability of the spike protein to bind to that ACE2 receptor, which is depicted in blue on the surface of the cell. So when you hear the term neutralization of the virus or viral neutralization, this is what we're referring to. So these antibodies are made when the body has been infected by the virus. And the goal is for your body to ultimately develop memory to the virus, so that each time you see it, your body immediately starts making antibodies against it. And then before you even know you've been infected, your body's already handling it and getting rid of it. Similarly, the vaccine stimulates the body to make antibodies to fight off the virus. However, if the virus changes too much, the concern is our antibodies may not recognize it anymore. So this could mean two things. So the first is that your natural immunity, which is made by when you get an infection from the COVID virus, concern is that your natural immunity won't work. So it's possible that the antibodies that you already made from a previous infection perhaps wouldn't be able to prevent a new infection by a new variant of the virus. The second concern is that vaccine-induced immunity won't work. So this is the antibodies that you've generated from the vaccine. Perhaps those antibodies wouldn't recognize a new viral variant, and thus the vaccine would not be as effective. So before I talk about what's going on most recently with vaccines, I wanted to touch on ultimately what our goals are. So our vaccination goal is not COVID-0. So when we hear about vaccines in the news, we hear a lot about numbers and efficacy, but I don't think we hear enough about understanding what our goals of vaccination are. So when this pandemic started, many of us, myself included, were waiting for it to be over and for COVID to go away. Now, more than a year into this, I've reframed my expectations. So COVID is probably not going to go away, but we know there are many other viruses, and most of them don't shut the world down. So we just need to get COVID to the point where it isn't shutting our lives down and where we can start to return to the things that we enjoy and bring us to some semblance of normalcy. So in order for that to happen, COVID needs to become more like the other viruses. It needs to be less deadly, cause less hospitalizations, and also not infect the entire global population at the same time. And there are several ways of doing that. So scientists are targeting all of those ways, working constantly around the clock on therapies to make the disease milder if you do get sick. And vaccines are a huge part of this. And although it would be amazing if vaccines could prevent COVID 100% of the time, this isn't a realistic expectation for this vaccine or really any vaccine in general. So what we want and what getting the vaccine will do is ultimately to prevent severe disease and prevent the need for hospitalization and prevent death. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about the newest player in the US, the Janssen vaccine made by Johnson & Johnson. And one more thing before I get into that, though, is that we know that now there are multiple vaccines available that are being developed. And in our last talk, we spoke about the technology of the initial mRNA vaccines made by Pfizer and Moderna, which are the only vaccines that have been available in the United States up until recently. And as many of you may know, when the pandemic started, multiple scientists and companies immediately began developing different types of vaccines using different technologies, and with the ultimate goal that we would have enough vaccine for the global population. And we're very fortunate that the vaccines that have been developed thus far have surpassed our expectations and are very effective. But recently, one more vaccine was given emergency use approval by the FDA, and that's our Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or Janssen vaccine. So the technology used to develop this vaccine is called an adenovirus vector. And this is where a completely inactivated virus called an adenovirus is used to deliver the genetic code or recipe for that COVID spike protein that we've talked a lot about. And it stimulates your body to make the spike protein. So this is very similar to what the mRNA vaccines do, get our body to make the spike protein. So this technology has been used for other vaccines before. So we're very familiar with this, and there is a lot of safety data available demonstrating that it's very safe. In the Johnson & Johnson trials, they've tested 20,000 people who got the vaccine compared to 20,000 who received the placebo. And similarly to other vaccine trials, the people who participated ranged in age, race, ethnicity, and comorbid medical conditions. So you can see in the graph that the incidence of COVID infections, which is depicted on the y-axis, is the same in the placebo and vaccinated group until about 14 days after the vaccine dose. But once they get to 14 days after that dose is given, you see that the vaccinated group has significantly less infections than the placebo group. And this ultimate vaccine produced an efficacy of 85% at preventing severe disease by day 28 after the vaccine. And amazingly, there were no deaths in the vaccinated group. Additionally, this trial included regions in South Africa and Brazil where the variants are present. And they also were able to prevent severe disease there as well. The nice thing about this vaccine is that it just requires one vaccination, one shot. You don't have to coordinate a second visit. But bottom line, and the moral of this is that if you get the Johnson vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, or the Moderna vaccine, we know that you're almost entirely prevented against death and severe disease from COVID. So the most important thing you can do is to go and get the first vaccine available for you. So let's just talk about vaccine and women who are pregnant or breastfeeding. Studies now show that pregnant mothers and breastfeeding mothers with COVID are actually passing antibodies onto their babies. We have some preliminary data showing this, and we think this is likely similar for mothers who are vaccinated. So the chance to pass on your immunity to your baby to prevent COVID, I think, is just one more reason to get vaccinated. The CDC also has been closely following pregnant and breastfeeding women and have not seen adverse effects, and they're continuously enrolling many women who are pregnant and receive the vaccine to follow for any concerns. At New York Presbyterian, we're also studying this and can provide information on how to get involved in these studies for anyone who might be interested, and we'll provide some of that information at the end. And in case you need one more good reason to get the vaccine, the CDC just put out some new recommendations for vaccinated people. That is probably one of the biggest changes, I would say, in terms of how it affects our lives. So they state that you can socialize with other vaccinated people indoors without wearing masks or physical distancing. If you are vaccinated, you may socialize with unvaccinated people from a single household who are at low risk for severe COVID-19 disease indoors without wearing masks or physical distancing. And if you are vaccinated, there is no need to quarantine or test after a known exposure if you remain asymptomatic. And by vaccinated, this does mean fully vaccinated, meaning at least 2 weeks after the last dose in the vaccine series. So, and this leads to our last topic before the Mythbuster section. What about vaccines in children? Of course, as pediatricians, that's what we wanted to know about right away. And in very exciting news, Pfizer has fully enrolled its pediatric COVID-19 vaccine trial with just over 2,000 participants for age 12 to 15 years and plans to enroll younger children later this year. And Moderna is completing enrollment for its study of children 12 to 15 years. And these trials are all phase 2 and 3 trials, meaning that they are looking to see if the vaccines work for children and also to see what the best dose may be. And additionally, we're just learned that Moderna and Johnson & Johnson also have plans to continue to enroll younger children in the near future. So even Moderna said that they're starting to enroll children age 6 months and up. So now my colleague, Dr. Deborah Levine, a specialist in pediatric emergency medicine, will bust some myths about COVID and the vaccine. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ecker. Thank you. And welcome to our Mythbuster section. So I'm going to debunk some myths about the viral variants. So the first myth we're going to talk about is that the vaccine won't be effective against these new variants. So the vaccines are effective against these variants. They're very effective. The vaccines help your awesome immune system set up this complex protection against the virus. They work against the variants. We're seeing this from studies of the newer vaccines, the Johnson & Johnson and the Novavax. So all the vaccines that we have now can protect us from severe disease and death, and this is amazing. Our next myth is that the vaccines are dangerous. And this is not the case. The vaccines are very safe. We are so far 7,000, there is very close monitoring and careful, we're doing a very close and careful monitoring of all people who are receiving the vaccine. There are people who die in the United States and all over the world every day. And they are monitoring to make sure that there is no correlation between the vaccines and other adverse effects of the world population. So these are very safe. And this is a slide just to show you, because we are carefully monitoring every single patient who gets a vaccine through this vaccine surveillance that the United States government has. We're carefully monitoring, and the FDA is carefully investigating, as well as the CDC, any person who has any type of adverse event. But just to show you that there are things that will happen in the normal population, and you have to be very careful to assume that there's a causation with something else. And this is just a very interesting graph that if you look at the red line, it shows you the per capita cheese consumption. And you can see the graph. And then in the black line, it shows the number of people who died by being tangled in their bed sheets. And if you look at this graph head on, you just think that there's some association between eating cheese and dying from being tangled in the bed sheets. When you think about it, there's no correlation whatsoever. So sometimes we hear of people having adverse events in the world. We think they may be tied to the COVID vaccine administration, and it may not be true. And just to reiterate, we are monitoring all the time to make sure, but so far no one has associated any adverse events, any severe deaths and due to the vaccines. So the next myth we're going to talk about is that diagnostic tests don't recognize the variants. So the tests do recognize COVID, even with the variants. Most of the PCR tests that are being performed to evaluate COVID look for different targets of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and are still able to identify disease. But there's always going to be cases when you may have COVID and the test can be falsely negative. So if the suspicion is high, you may have symptoms or you've been exposed, the test should be repeated at a later date. But most of the tests will still be able to pick up the virus. The next myth we'll debunk is that the UK variant is more deadly. So we don't know yet. And that's actually probably a good thing, because if the virus was deadlier, we would have recognized that already. So overall, not being as deadly may not be a cause for celebration, because even though we don't want a virus that's more deadly, A virus that's more transmissible can still result in more deaths over the long run. Take, for example, if you have a virus where each person infects one other person, and let's say about 0.8% will die. If there are 10,000 people infected, you'll probably get approximately like 130 people dying in a month. If that virus is 50% more fatal, then your death rate doubles to 1.6%, and you'll get almost 200 deaths. But if it's 50% more transmissible, more people are infected, and therefore there'll be more deaths, almost 1,000. So not being as deadly, it still could be more deadly later on if the virus is more transmissible. And that's why we talk about using precautions like masks and social distancing in the meantime. The next myth we'll debunk is that children are getting very sick with the UK variant. And again, children are still really doing well, even with this new variant. There is lots of media talk of children filling up hospital wards and ICUs, and this is not the case. Children are getting sick, but they're usually doing very well and recovering well. And we haven't seen any change, even with the new variants. The next myth we'll talk about is that children are more likely to spread the UK variant. So everyone is more likely to spread this UK variant, but children are still less likely to spread than adults. This chart shows some data about the UK variant. And if you can look in the red box, it highlights children 0 to 9 years of age and children 10 to 19 years of age. And if you read from left to right, it lists all the contacts that these children had. And then in the red box in the middle are the contacts of the kids with the UK variant and how many actually developed COVID. So 9% of contacts for kids 0 to 9 years of age and about 12% of contacts for kids 10 to 19 years of age were exposed, and compared to the got COVID, and compared to the older groups, it was about 20%. So this variant was much more contagious. Everybody is spreading it more, but children are still spreading it less than the adults. And this slide is actually great because we are seeing from Wisconsin that you can see that in Wisconsin, even though they're in school with masking and distancing, they're able to keep the spread very low. So even with schools open, we're seeing the spread very low, which is telling us that the children are spreading it less. The next myth is that the variants are not in the United States. So unfortunately, the variants are here and probably more than we know. Some countries are actually looking for them more, so it's more apparent. Denmark, for example, is sequencing every positive test to check for mutations. But in the United States, we're only sequencing less than about 1% of cases, though our sequencing has started to increase. But all of this leads to some uncertainty. The variants are probably in the United States all over, but this is reassuring because we know that nothing terrible has happened since the variants arrived. We still see the spread, but things have really not progressed much more seriously. So they are here, and we are still going through the same motions to combat it, like masking, social distancing, and now the vaccine. So the next myth is that one mask isn't enough anymore. Dr. Fauci recently made this comment about wearing 2 masks. So this is one really cute study that shows that not all masks are the same. You may not need 2 masks if you have one really good one. So a person recorded with us, recorded a phrase. They said, "Stay healthy," and they wore no masks, and then they wore all different kinds of masks, and they measured the droplets. And they did this 10 times to make sure they were getting real data. And you can see the pictures of all the different masks that they tried. And the graph shows you the different droplet counts with each mask. And you can see the surgical mask was very good at preventing the spread. There weren't a lot of droplets. And the poly cotton mask was also very good. But if you compare them to the knitted masks, the bandanas, and the worst of all, the neck gaiter, there were many more droplets spread when speaking the same phrase. So it's important to wear an appropriate mask with more than one layer, especially if you're going into crowded areas or on airline flights. But certainly if you're in the outdoors, very distanced from other people, certainly wearing one proper mask is enough. So the CDC just updated their website with better ways to wear a mask. And this is going to give you things that'll create a better seal. So there's better fit and less droplet sharing. So using a nose wire, using a mask fitter or brace, making sure it's very snug, adding layers. So one mask will have multiple layers, or having two masks if each one is a single layer, and knotting the edges of the mask to make it fit more snugly. So our final myth is that I should just give up. And we don't want you to give up. We all have pandemic fatigue, and it's very hard. And every time we take a step forward in the right direction, we feel like we're taking 2 steps backwards. But our tried and true methods still work. Masking and social distancing can help spread the virus throughout. We all work in a hospital system with many patients infected with COVID, and we are doing the same methods that you do in your community to keep ourselves safe, and it works, and we are true testaments of that. And now the vaccines are here, and they're going to make a big difference with the trajectory of this disease. It's important to adjust our expectations. We aren't looking to make COVID totally disappear, though we'd like to. We want to make it tolerable. We want it to be a normal viral illness, one that doesn't send so many people to the hospital, so we can go on with our lives. And I will now give it to my colleague, Dr. Shari Platt, who is our Vice Chair, Pediatric Emergency Medicine, and she will moderate our question and answer session. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Drs. Gerber, Acker, and Levine. That was great information, very cutting edge, and very relatable to all people on this webinar, and to parents and physicians who we're focusing on. Hopefully teachers are on here today, I hope. So a lot of the questions today have to do with children, which is great. We're all pediatrics, so we can answer those questions really well. I'll just start by saying, one question from somebody is, are the trials on children specifically looking at children with underlying conditions, such as food allergies or asthma? Like, is there a focus on children with underlying conditions in the trials as we test the vaccine on children? And maybe Dr. Acker? You might want to unmute if you're speaking.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Dr. Black, can you just say that question one more time?
Sure. So the question is, are the trials looking at children, are they specifically looking at children with underlying conditions or at risk?
So at this point, I mean, I know they are starting to enroll the younger children. I don't know exactly what populations they're targeting. My assumption is that healthier populations, but perhaps Dr. Permar can help out with knowing if which populations they're including.
Yeah, and in fact, I actually looked this up as you were talking because there was a similar question. And there is actually a website that describes each of the trials called clintrials.gov. So information is there on every clinical trial ongoing, including the pediatric vaccine trials. And I just looked at one it was a Moderna vaccine being tested in ages 12 to 18. And they, on their exclusion criteria of children that they would not enroll, the only piece about allergy was a previous allergic reaction to a vaccine. And so they would be including, those are very common conditions, food allergies, asthma. So I would assume that there will be a number of children in that trial in particular that will have those conditions.
Thank you. And that gets me to another question. I guess you pretty much answered, but I just want to specifically focus on children with severe allergies or who need an EpiPen or carry an EpiPen. There has been some caution about giving the vaccine to adults who have severe allergies. Can somebody comment on that for children?
Yeah, Dr. Platt, I can comment because I've spoken to some of our allergists about that specifically. And for what they really are recommending is that if your child has a severe allergy, to talk to your allergist because they are very familiar with every component of the vaccine. And if they need to perhaps test your child against a particular component, or if they can just, we'll get that really thorough history to find out, you know, does your child potentially have an allergy to that component? And if once they do that, they're not necessarily going to deter your child from getting the vaccine, but to do so with precautions. Having an EpiPen with you, making sure your child is watched for at least 30 minutes after receiving the vaccine, being in an area where if there, you know, you could have the appropriate resources if you needed it.
One thing maybe I can add is from the many millions of adults that have gotten the mRNA vaccines now that had some initial concerns about anaphylaxis, it seemed to be traced potentially to one component of the vaccine called polyethylene glycol. That's an extremely rare allergy, and that may be why we saw those allergies, but only very rarely. But just so you know, that is the same ingredient of Miralax. So if you've ever given your child Miralax, they should not have an allergy to the polyethylene glycol. So, so when you talk to your allergist, you can maybe discuss the components of the vaccine, including the polyethylene glycol.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions about children and vaccines. Is the vaccine safe for children with cancer or who are in cancer remission? And is there a specific vaccine of the three that are available that we should be focusing on for that population? Or actually, maybe just answer, is there any underlying condition or risk factor that would make you want to get one particular vaccine versus another?
Start with this one. From the adult trials, so right now the pediatric trials are underway, so we don't know with 100% certainty, but the adult trials were enrolling people with various medical conditions. And it seems to be safe and efficacious for all comers. And so I don't think that there's any one vaccine that should be prioritized in any specific condition. And I expect that that will hold true for the pediatric population as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. And can we talk a little bit about the longevity of the vaccine? And does anybody know if we're expecting to be getting boosters of the vaccine? And then another question related to boosters is, should we be trying to get more than one vaccine this year, more than one of the COVID vaccines?
Well, I think the studies are not clear yet. I think it's too early to tell. But I think the companies that are making the vaccines are in the process of reworking, I think, their vaccines to adjust to the new variants. So it's possible we may need boosters, but I think until there's more data, we're not sure. I think we need to adhere to the regimens that each manufacturer has. So for the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, it's recommended to get 2 doses. And then for the Johnson & Johnson, currently it's recommended to get 1. So I think we should be following that. I don't know if Sally, you have anything else to add to that?
Nope, that's right. But we may see testing going on with additional variants in the near future of the vaccine.
Thank you. The next question relates to transmitting COVID if you've had the vaccine. Can somebody comment? This gets brought up a lot about having asymptomatic COVID, or are you at risk of giving somebody COVID if you have had the vaccine?
I can attempt to answer this. So yeah, this question certainly comes up a lot, and what the vaccines were studying primarily was whether you got COVID, whether you got the actual disease. And their primary outcomes were not looking at transmission, because really the ultimate goal is to prevent severe disease. And usually when you're preventing infection in someone, you're going to impact transmission. But because they didn't look at that specifically, we can't say for sure that you aren't potentially transmitting some virus, harboring some virus without actually developing symptoms. So, and we've seen with other vaccine types that are good at preventing severe infections that you can still sometimes have, get an infection but have no symptoms and potentially spread it. So that's why everyone is so hesitant to kind of let our guard down, even as we're vaccinating more and more of our population. As more people get vaccinated, then and herd immunity, you get closer to herd immunity, we really won't have to worry about transmission as much. But for now, it's still quite an unknown, and so we still have to, continue doing what we call our non-pharmaceutical measures to prevent infection and spread.
Great, thank you. Can somebody comment on the timing of the vaccine as it relates to if you've recently received a different vaccine?
Yes, so what the CDC is recommending, and I think it mostly has to do with not attributing certain symptoms to something else you may have received. So if you received one vaccine, they are recommending that you wait at least 2 weeks before getting a COVID vaccine. And from my understanding, that's really just so that you're not, just to decrease any potential variables of, so that if something's happening from the COVID vaccine, we know from that and we can track that closely. But in the future, I imagine that we won't have to separate vaccines. The same way that kids get multiple vaccines at the same time, and the immune response to one is not really affected by the immune response to others, depending on the technology of the vaccine. I anticipate that that will change. But for now, they are recommending some separation.
Thank you. So I know we've talked a lot about clinical trials for children, and we're so excited that they're starting. Do we have any idea of what the timeline is going to be and when we could expect to roll this out for real with our children?
Maybe I'll answer that. The first thing to know is that 16-year-olds and 17 and 18 and above can get vaccinated as soon as their group is called. The Pfizer vaccine was approved down to age 16. So if you have a 16, 17, 18 or above year old, make sure that you are watching to get them signed up for a vaccine. And in fact, we should be starting at Weill Cornell, the vaccine being available to that group starting next week. So we can find out more about that. But for the rest of children, I do think that the down to age 12 data will be available soon from the Pfizer vaccine, and Moderna is currently studying the vaccine down to age 12. So for 12-year-olds, I think that will happen this year. It would be great if it was before school started, but I'm not sure it'll be that quick. But I think before the end of the year, we will see vaccines at least down to age 12 and maybe even down to school age kids that are starting to be enrolled now.
Thank you. This is a great question. Somebody asked if children who are unvaccinated can be at home with close family members or specifically grandparents who are fully vaccinated without wearing their masks.
I can take this one. I think when you're thinking about these things, it's always really complicated because you have to think about what is the risk to each individual who's involved in that interaction. And so generally the biggest concern was that children would spread the disease to their grandparents who are at higher risk for severe complications for the disease. And once the grandparents are vaccinated, their risk for severe disease and death goes down like amazingly. And so the risk of the child, if they did have COVID during that interaction, spreading it to their grandparents and the grandparents getting very sick decreases substantially. And then looking at it the other way around, what if the grandparents happen to be carrying the disease and are asymptomatic and transmit it to the children? And we know that fortunately children have been doing really, really well with the disease. And so it's kind of, everything is going to come down to an individual decision. But I think at this point, once the grandparents are vaccinated, that's a huge relief in those interactions. And that's what led to the CDC changing their recommendations about people who are vaccinated being able to interact without masks, and then having small gatherings where vaccinated people and unvaccinated people can interact if the unvaccinated people are at low risk for severe disease. And so just personally, we're seeing our vaccinated grandparents again in my house.
Great, thank you. This is also a great question. Somebody wanted to know the efficacy, how good is the vaccine if somebody is on immunosuppressive treatment? So if they're taking a medicine that might suppress their immune system for something else, will the vaccine cause a boost in antibodies to protect against COVID?
Oh, sorry. I can take a stab at that. So we don't know exactly, in that group exactly what the efficacy is with them compared to others. And whenever we have someone with who's immunosuppressed, the thought is that perhaps they won't mount the same immune response compared to normal. And so that's certainly possible. There are, many aspects to our immune system. So really the type of immunosuppression that someone is on, immunosuppressive medications, or the reason that they're immunosuppressed will also affect how they respond to a vaccine and which arms of the immunity. I still think that there will be an element of immunity that will be protective. Just how protective, I'm not entirely sure.
That's great, thanks. So somebody wanted to know if we can expect any changes in the guidelines around social distancing so that children can safely but conveniently go back to school as soon as possible.
I think, in general, the recommendation through the American Academy of Pediatrics, and something that I think all of us strongly agree with, is that to as much extent as possible, children should be in school in person. I think that we are still going to need to take precautions for the immediate future. And so things like wearing masks, things like cohorting, having smaller class sizes are still going to be an important feature in making sure that it's safe for our children to be at school. But at this point, we have a lot of evidence showing that children being in school doesn't seem to really contribute substantially to community spread. And so that really should be a priority, having our children be in person for school as much as possible.
Just to add on that, even during the height of our pandemic in the spring, daycares were open, especially for healthcare workers' children. There was very limited spread in that setting. We've seen the studies of kids in school in the United States and abroad, and really they're showing very great results. And I think the real push from the CDC and the AAP is really to open those schools. So with the proper setting.
Great, thank you. Can somebody comment a little bit about COVID, a COVID illness or protection from COVID in newborns of women who have either had the disease or have had the vaccine? I know we touched on this in the talk, but maybe if somebody could elaborate on it.
Well, I can elaborate. I mean, so there's kind of two sides. There's whether there's the biology. Okay, are the antibodies that moms are making, are they getting passed through the placenta during the third trimester, which is how antibodies are normally passed on from mom to baby. And we have seen that that is happening with COVID antibodies, and it's likely thought to be from vaccines as well. And whether that antibodies in the baby, then there's the reality. We've got the biology, and then there's the reality. Does that result in actual protection? And my group, my colleagues in the infectious disease division have been closely following newborns born to moms who either have COVID at the time of delivery or who had COVID at some time during pregnancy. And we've seen close to 700 babies, and it's been remarkable how well they've been doing. That babies seem to be one of the most protected populations against COVID. So whether that's due to antibodies being passed on or just the fact that they're not highly susceptible to COVID infection, I don't know for sure, but I can reassure you that overall baby, I have not seen anything to suggest that COVID is affecting babies poorly.
Thank you. The questions are sort of a little bit going back and forth, so I apologize. Somebody would like to know about if we expect that this is going to be an annual vaccine, or is this a one-time thing?
I think we don't entirely know the answer to that question yet. For all of the people who were enrolled in the vaccine trials, they are continuing to be studied. And so they're tracking to see if they get infected, they're tracking to see their immune response and how long it's lasting. But there is also now the consideration of the viral variants. And while the vaccines are working against them, we just don't entirely know what the future is going to hold. And so all of the vaccine companies are already adjusting their vaccines and making boosters and getting things prepared so that if in the future we do need boosters or we need a slight change in the vaccine that's available, that will be ready for us. But we don't 100% know the answer to that question yet.
Thank you. So this is kind of interesting. And I guess this will be probably, and I don't know answer, I apologize, but we can't predict the future. But I do think it's an interesting concept to think about, is that we don't really know the long-term effects of the vaccine, but we also don't entirely know the long-term effects of having had COVID. Can somebody comment on how do you weigh the pros and the cons of the risk of having, especially in children, particularly because we've sort of know that they are at lower risk of having severe disease and adverse outcome, except for the multi-system inflammatory syndrome, whether it's worth a risk of vaccine versus a risk of getting COVID in children.
I mean, I'm sorry. It's a great question. I really am a big advocate of vaccinations. I feel viruses are very difficult to treat, and it's very difficult to know if you are going to be the one to develop a worse course. We don't have medicines that really target the virus per se that we have for bacteria. And that's why we develop vaccinations to be able to prevent the virus from attacking you. So I really think it's important to prevent and instead of taking your chances with getting the infections. Many complications are very rare in children, but they're not zero. And the safety profile of vaccinations seem very very, very positive, and very safe. And all of us would vaccinate our children with no thought at all.
Thank you.
Add on to that, there are a lot of studies ramping up now on whether there's any kind of post-COVID syndrome in both children and adults. And there's some hints that maybe there are some long-term issues with fatigue, feeling short of breath, some mental health issues. And so the vaccines, we don't expect to have any of that, where viruses we know can often do this. So again, another reason to prevent rather than take the chances.
Thank you. A quick one, is it safe to get the vaccine at any time during pregnancy?
So, you know, yes, exactly. I should just start out with yes. And one thing that I found interesting, obstetrician, during one of the kind of initial town halls we had on pregnancy and vaccines, yet there's really no biological plausibility of why the vaccine wouldn't be safe in pregnancy. But one issue is that for the first trimester of pregnancy, there is a high rate of miscarriage at baseline. And so that would just happen anyway. That's when you're could potentially miscarry. And that's why women are always nervous until they get to that certain point of pregnancy. So if you get it on a vaccine really early and then you're to miscarry, you know, I think that could cause a lot of guilt. And I think that, but I don't think that's an effect of the vaccine. So some obstetricians may say, you know, maybe try and wait a little, but ultimately I do think that it is ultimately safe at any point during pregnancy.
And the other thing to add to that is that we know that COVID can cause more severe disease in pregnancy. So it's more dangerous while you're pregnant. Mm-hmm. And so getting the vaccine and protecting yourself and your baby is ultimately going to help you in the long run from that perspective as well.
Thank you. Okay, it's 6 o'clock. I have the very last question. I think we'll just sneak it in really quickly is, can somebody please comment on immunity in somebody who has had the COVID infection versus somebody who has had the COVID vaccine? And if I guess we can add, if you've had COVID, should you still get the vaccine?
So I think for right now, this also kind of falls into the categories of unknowns. We are generally finding and think that the immunity that you're getting from vaccination is going to be more robust and longer lasting than the immunity that you get from a natural COVID infection. And so there probably is value to getting vaccinated, even if you've had COVID, and expecting that immunity will be more robust and longer lasting. But it's definitely something that's being looked at. For right now, the recommendation is definitely to get the vaccines as directed. So getting 2 doses of the Pfizer and Moderna or 1 dose of the J&J vaccine, regardless of whether or not you've had COVID.
Thank you. Yeah, Thank you, everybody. Sorry, Karen, you wanted to add?
Oh, just to add that the CDC does recommend that if you do have COVID, you just wait till you complete your 10-day isolation period before getting the vaccine. But then you can get it. And you're thought to be protected within the first 90 days after natural infection, but it doesn't mean you can't get it during that time.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining today. I'm sorry we went 2 minutes over. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to everybody's questions, but there were so many really brilliant questions out there. We were very honored to have this webinar, and thank you for joining us. And we hope that we've debunked some of the myths and made things clearer. And we hope that you go out and get your vaccine tomorrow. So thank you so much. Be well and be safe.